Welcome to One Friend Focus, where we focus on transforming the world one friend at a time. Now, my name is Bill Nissen, and through my years of being a pastor and also my years in business leadership, I've learned that the most important element needed in life is friendship. So welcome to this podcast discussing friendship and all of the wonderful things that surround this topic. And I do want to thank you for the amazing response that I've been getting from our first podcast, where I kind of shared the vision of what's not worked and what is working and just what drives me to do this whole thing called One Friend Focus. I said, great response. And a couple things I wanted to answer right away on this podcast. One was people said they love the topic and want to know how they can donate. And to be completely honest, right now, I don't have a way to donate. We will be setting that up soon because of your request and get that set up with the 501c3. But at this point, hang tight, because I've really been just starting this out of my own heart and desiring this. But I could see where that support will help us to grow this down the road. So keep tuned, stay in tune for that announcement as it comes down the road. Secondly, what I realized after getting some of the feedback from people is I think this podcast will be well served by becoming more of a historical study. And here's why. There's a lot of people that they think, wow, this makes sense, but I just have no reference point for it. I never saw what was going on in the world today as not helpful or not feeding this goal. So I thought it'd be really good for you to kind of see from my perspective, and I also have a guest that I'm going to add to this, because I had a conversation with a friend of mine. His name is David Collister. Still is, because he's still around. But we discussed the whole thing of mentorship. Now, mentorship is one of the things on the back end with the 2 Timothy 2:2 thing that we addressed. But he's touching on something that's really cultural in the whole aspect of how we do relationship, which in the past, the natural response to trusting relationships was mentorship, but it's not so today. So let's listen to this little quote from David about the historical perspective of mentorship.
In 1776, 83% of the U.S. population was self-employed.
Yes.
And what that was, Bill, it was store owners and farmers and families ran their own businesses. And people grew up not just in a family where they went to work separately, came home and had dinner together, watched a couple television shows together, and then they went their separate ways. In those days, houses were very small and, farms very big, and you had to work with each other very closely. And there was constant mentorship going on between fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, fathers, daughters, mothers, sons. And oftentimes entire families were working together. And now it's flipped. Most people have jobs. They don't work for themselves. People don't grow up in family businesses. And we don't even know how to mentor or be mentored. Like, most dads don't get enough time with their kids to even model, you know what I mean? Like real heart-to-heart, one-on-one time. It's just not happening.
And I couldn't agree with David more in the fact that, it's changed, it's flipped, where we're so busy doing our jobs, doing the things that are going on in life, that we don't actually have time to do things with our family and our friends. And that's one of the things we've got to change. But that's a tall order to ask, because our whole society has been designed for isolation. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. If you've ever seen like the Andy Griffith Show, you saw the houses, and if you go to older neighborhoods in most cities, you go by older houses that were built in the 40s or 50s, and they all had a front porch. And if you had a car, it was out back in a little single stall, garage. But a lot of people didn't even have that. They just had a little gravel road on the side of the house. They just pulled up, their car at that point if they didn't have maybe a breezeway or something. Then you look at where housing is today. And granted, some of this is because cars have become much more a part of our society. But nevertheless, you never see people walking in front of the house anymore, waving to people on the front porch. When you drive home from work, you're pulling into a garage that automatically rolls up, and you drive your car in, and then it automatically rolls back down, and you're cut off from everybody on the street and everybody around you. And that's just a fact. That's the way it is. And then our front porch no longer exists. If there is a front porch, it's for aesthetic reasons. It's for, just for, the look of the architecture of the house. But the real life activity goes on in the backyard, in a screened-in porch, or on a deck that is fenced in and protected from any interaction from anybody else other than your immediate family. That's the result of our society becoming more isolated and not building friendships. And to make another point on this is I was in Washington, D.C. This would have been, oh my goodness, at least 20 years ago. And I was studying real estate because we were looking at doing some real estate investing. And they were showing, even at that point, that especially on the coasts, that all these high-rise condos and living quarters, all of them were designed for you to own pets rather than children. They didn't even have full kitchens in these condos anymore, just a little kitchenette to heat up stuff because you'd go out to eat if you were going to go do something. But on every, fourth or fifth floor, there would be a pet park. And these were the statistics I received from the Urban Land Institute at ULI, is that the vast majority of people, especially on the coasts, their closest friendships were their pets. And so they gave more credence to that. So every third or fourth floor was a pet park where you could take your dog or your cat, your pet, and let them go, have a walk indoors and go to the restroom there too. And everything was accommodating that because that was the friendships and the integral aspect of everyday living for today's person or family. Where back in the 1950s, you knew your neighbors. You knew everybody was coming around. There was a natural interaction of friendship and connection and community that we have to almost organize today because we have created communities that are dedicated to isolating ourselves from one another. And the reason why I think it's important for us to look at this, first of all, what David said about, historically, when this, in the 1700s, you were mentored. That's how you were raised up, to work with your dad and for the mother to work with the daughter. I'm not saying, we have to go backwards. I'm just saying it was part of their lifestyle to teach and raise up their children to learn how to live. And today, with families working 2 or 3 jobs, they're not home. In the 70s, we started hearing the term latchkey kids, which were children that had come home from school and they had to lock themselves in their house to protect themselves so they could just watch TV or do something else because there was no parent home because everybody was at work. And so we started seeing this isolation start there and just grow from there. And when we lose that sense of community, then you have more violence, you have more battles that go on in your neighborhoods and in your communities as it stands. There wasn't anything like a gated community back in the 50s. And much of that wasn't because we couldn't afford it or because the economy didn't do it. It wasn't the way we were wired. We weren't wired to be isolated. We were wired to get to know one another and celebrate those connections that we had in life. So that is something that we don't, especially as younger people today, we just don't understand that life hasn't always been the way it is now. So I'm going to share another little quote from David talking about social media, because that leads to our culture today.
Facebook and social media is taking us a mile wide and an inch deep in our relationships. Like, you might have hundreds or thousands of friends, but they're just very surface level relationships. And who's, what's your favorite cat video of the day, or whatever you're doing. But it's just not satisfying sociologically and psychologically. They're studying the effects of these shallow relationships, and it's causing an increase in depression and isolation. And it's so, Bill, there's never been a time where it's been more needed, at least in the U.S. here, where people are so disconnected from their families.
So ironically, social media, which is supposed to be connecting us and getting us back together, is actually doing the opposite. We're losing the art of hearing one another. What we're doing is we're posting what we want to say and then hide behind our profile and then get offended if somebody says some nasty comment to it. Instead of hearing each other's heart and really getting an understanding of what people are wanting to say and do. And I can back this up by my own experience. Is just recently, I connected with some people back home who've been following me on Facebook, and they got offended by a couple posts on my Facebook because it was a different opinion than they had. And it was ironic because one of those posts wasn't even mine. It was just one I allowed on my timeline. And so they were like acting funny when I saw them. And I said, what's going on? Because I was reading their body language. So I called them on it. They said, no, nothing, but you got to just be more careful about what you post on Facebook. You really said some stuff that was just ridiculous. And I said, let's do something right now. Let's just sit down. Let me hear your heart. What did you hear? I didn't even know what the posts were. And I know what? I never even got to know what both posts were. I just found out about the one that somebody else had posted. But what I did do was, through that interaction that can only happen when you're right there with one another, looking each other's eyes, hearing each other's heart, is I understood what they heard, which wasn't what was said. And so I affirmed them in what hurt them, but then redirected them in saying, are you open to finding out that's not what was being said? You know my heart. And so we started to interact, and we were able to close that gap. We didn't have to have the distance, because we heard one another, because we actually did dialogue instead of ranting about my post on their Facebook post and letting it just spiral out of control like we see people do all the time. So I say all that to say, a lot of you think you have friends. And in the context of today's world, you do. But what we need to see society change is to really up the ante on what we call a friend. It's somebody you walk with. It's somebody you care about. And I'm going to share one more quote. This is from a friend of mine named Lewis Collins. We had a discussion a while back, and I captured his thoughts on this very thing of walking with one another.
Everything that he did, he was about relationship. And that's what confounded people. It's like, well, where'd he go? Oh, he's over there with the kids, or he's over there healing people. He's over there fellowship with people, having dinner with people, walking,
So as you hear me say in my first podcast about, we're not making friends, and that's what we need to do to advance the kingdom, and here's how it did work, now you can see the template of why it's been dysfunctional in America and why it's not happening today. So we have to be very intentional about changing the assumptions of our society with our actions. So I invite you to follow me on these podcasts and for us to interact more as we get our head around how to be more intentional about true friendships and community that can transform. And that's not going to happen overnight, but we have to start thinking about it today. So, Lord, I ask that you would speak to each one that is listening to this podcast, and that you would begin to really unearth in us a desire for your best instead of what we've known, and that you would help us to learn the depth of what you said when you said, I call you my friends. And we will talk about that on another podcast down the road. But God bless you. And I look forward to your feedback, just like you gave me this time. It's been amazing. And I look forward to talking to you soon.